June 24, 1942. Somewhere in the Solomon Sea, the submarine USS Sea Dragon stalked its prey beneath the waves. Inside the control room, red lights flickered across sweating faces. The sonar operator whispered, "Target bearing 090, range 2,000 yards." Lieutenant Commander Charles Ferreter gave the order every submariner lived for. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. The hiss of compressed air filled the compartment as 3 Mark 14 torpedoes left their tubes and vanished into the darkness. 30 seconds later, the crew waited for the sound that meant survival, the deep shattering boom of impact. Instead, there was silence. Then a faint metallic clang followed by nothing. The captain's knuckles tightened on the periscope handles. Runtime, 38 seconds, no detonation. The second officer muttered, "They ran under her, sir, all 3. On the surface, the Japanese transport vessel plowed forward untouched. Within minutes, the tables turned. The enemy's depth charges began to fall. Shock waves slammed through Sea Dragon's hull as gauges shattered and bulkheads groaned. For 94 American sailors, the realization struck like a blow. The Navy's most advanced torpedo, the weapon they had trusted with their lives, didn't work. Over the next 6 months across the vast Pacific, this same nightmare replayed again and again. Submarine commanders returned to base with stories too absurd to be believed. Torpedoes that failed to explode, torpedoes that swerved off course, even torpedoes that circled back and nearly sank their own subs. The numbers were staggering. Reports indicated that more than 60% of all Mark 14 torpedoes fired in 1942 either malfunctioned or detonated prematurely. Each failure meant an enemy ship escaping destruction and dozens of Allied sailors dying in return. In Washington, officials at the Bureau of Ordnance refused to accept the evidence. They insisted the problem was not the weapon, but the men firing it. The Mark 14, they claimed, was flawless. It had been designed with the latest engineering precision, equipped with a magnetic detonator that promised near-perfect performance. On paper, it was unstoppable. In reality, it was killing its own crews. The Pacific became a cruel equation. Every time a submarine commander fired his weapons, he was gambling the lives of his men on a device that might not even detonate. Behind every failed attack was a funeral no one would ever hold. Destroyers hunted submarines that should have been predators. Convoys slipped through kill zones untouched. The Imperial Japanese Navy, unaware of the Americans' internal crisis, began calling their enemies' torpedoes the duds. What no one in command could explain was why the failures seemed so random. In tropical waters, torpedoes struck too deep. In colder seas, their magnetic triggers exploded early. The mechanical designs were classified, the test data buried under secrecy, and the officers who questioned the weapon were quietly silenced or reassigned. Yet beneath that wall of denial, a quiet truth was forming that the problem wasn't human error or bad luck. It was hidden somewhere in the mathematics of the torpedo itself. America's submarines weren't losing to Japan, they were losing to their own engineering. And as the casualty lists grew longer, somewhere deep inside a quiet naval testing facility in Virginia, a young woman surrounded by stacks of data sheets and endless columns of numbers began to suspect the truth that no admiral dared to face. She was not a commander, not a soldier, and had never seen a torpedo in her life. But her calculations would soon reveal the flaw that was killing America's sailors and change the entire course of the war beneath the Pacific. If you believe that a war can be lost by a single wrong equation, comment the number 7 below. If you think this disaster was caused by human pride, leave a like. Washington, D.C., late summer 1942. Inside the marble corridors of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, the war felt distant, almost theoretical. while men drowned in the Pacific, reports arrived neatly typed, stamped, and filed. Torpedo performance satisfactory, one memo read. Minor operator error noted, said another. On paper, America's submarine force was doing its job. In reality, commanders were begging for answers. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, the man who had championed the Mark 14 torpedo, sat behind a polished mahogany desk surrounded by technical diagrams and glowing performance charts. When the first complaints reached him from the Pacific, he dismissed them as hysteria. Our tests prove flawless operation, he told the press. If torpedoes are missing, the fault lies with the crews. The statement would haunt the Navy for years. What the Admiral never admitted publicly was that those tests had been conducted under perfect artificial conditions, calm seas, shallow ranges, and test warheads instead of live explosives. The Mark 14, designed in the 1930s during peacetime austerity, had never been fired in actual combat conditions. It was the Navy's secret shame, a weapon declared perfect without proof. Across the Pacific, commanders like Charles Lockwood and Dudley Morton sent desperate coded messages back to headquarters. Fired 4 torpedoes at freighter. 2 failed to detonate. 1 premature explosion. 1 circular run narrowly avoided. Each report carried the same chilling refrain, duds again. In Pearl Harbor, tempers boiled. Submarine captains began ignoring official protocols, loading older Mark 10 torpedoes from World War I, obsolete weapons but at least reliable. Yet when those torpedoes achieved confirmed kills, Washington ordered them back to standard issue. The Bureau's faith in the Mark 14 had become dogma. Admitting failure meant admitting that hundreds of sailors had died for nothing. The deeper the Navy looked, the stranger the pattern became. Some torpedoes struck targets and failed to explode. Others detonated early before contact. Still others missed, entirely passing harmlessly beneath ships that should have been destroyed. There was no clear variable, only chaos. Behind closed doors, a handful of frustrated engineers began to whisper theories. One blamed the new magnetic influence exploder, which was supposed to detect a ship's hull and detonate beneath it for maximum damage. Another suspected the depth-keeping mechanism, a complex balance of air pressure, temperature, and buoyancy that controlled how deep the weapon ran. The problem was, no one had the data to prove anything. Wartime secrecy prevented live testing. Production quotas left no time for redesign. And above all, the Bureau's senior officers refused to believe the weapon could be flawed. In September, an internal memo circulated quietly through the Ordnance Division. It was unsigned, typed on an unmarked sheet. Persistent malfunctions suggest fundamental design error. Recommend mathematical reevaluation of pressure and depth control systems. Most of the engineers ignored it, but one copy landed in a locked filing cabinet at the Naval Proving Ground, Dahlgren, Virginia, a quiet testing facility along the Potomac River where equations mattered more than rank. Dahlgren was a world away from the chaos of war. Inside low, whitewashed buildings, mathematicians, physicists, and engineers worked around the clock analyzing ballistics data, shell trajectories, and weapon reliability. Among them were a few women recruited under emergency wartime programs, clerks, calculators, computers, as the Navy called them. They weren't allowed on ships or ranges, but they could handle numbers faster and more precisely than most men. One of those women would change everything. Her name rarely appeared in official documents, just M.S. Hutchinson, a mathematician in her late 20s, assigned to the Torpedo Division. Her job was to compile range test data, align timing sequences, and transcribe the results of depth trials conducted months earlier. No one expected her to challenge the weapon's design. She was officially a human calculator. But as the reports piled up on her desk, she noticed something no one else had bothered to see. The failures weren't random at all. They followed a pattern tied to water density, latitude, and the torpedo's internal barometric calibration. In equatorial waters, where the magnetic field differed slightly from the North Atlantic, the Mark 14's magnetic exploder was triggering too early, sensing the ship's steel hull several meters above where it actually was. The result, explosions that happened in empty water. When the magnetic trigger failed, the contact exploder was supposed to detonate on impact, but data suggested something even worse. The contact pistons were jamming on high-speed hits crushed by their own inertia. In other words, the faster the torpedo struck, the less likely it was to explode. At Dahlgren, such conclusions would have been explosive politically, not physically. The Bureau of Ordnance had invested millions of dollars and its reputation in the Mark 14. To question it was to question the Navy itself. Still, Hutchinson kept running the numbers. Every test record, every failed firing report from the Pacific, every calibration log. Slowly, she built a mathematical model that predicted the exact conditions under which the torpedo would fail. It matched the field reports perfectly. Meanwhile, in Washington, the denial continued. When Admiral Lockwood finally ordered his own live-fire tests in Hawaii in early 1943, his results confirmed what the data had been screaming for months. The torpedoes were running 11 feet deeper than set. They weren't hitting too low because of poor aim. They were built wrong. But before Lockwood's revelation reached the headlines, before the Navy publicly admitted its mistake, one woman had already solved the mystery in silence. Her equations, scribbled in pencil on a stack of scrap paper, told the truth the admirals refused to see. The problem was no longer mechanical or magnetic. It was human, the arrogance that dismissed numbers as mere theory, while men died believing in perfection. If you believe that truth, no matter how inconvenient, always finds a way to surface comment the number 7 below. And if you think the most dangerous weapon in war is pride, not steel, hit the like button. The Naval Proving Ground at Dahlgren, Virginia, didn't look like a place where wars were won. It sat along the calm banks of the Potomac River, a quiet cluster of brick buildings, chalk-stained classrooms, and test ranges shrouded in morning fog. But inside those walls, the war was measured not in explosions or gunfire, but in decimals, equations, and margin notes. Margaret Hutchinson arrived every morning before sunrise. She wore the same navy blue jacket and carried a stack of graph paper under her arm. Her desk was a small wooden island in a sea of men, each hunched over drafting boards and slide rules. The others called her the calculator, a nickname that carried both respect and dismissal. She wasn't supposed to have opinions, only results. But she listened to the fragments of frustration muttered between engineers, to the whispers about the torpedo problem, to the nervous silence that always followed when someone mentioned the Pacific. Every afternoon, the courier delivered field reports from Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Fremantle. Bundles of paper thick with coordinates, detonation times, and failure notes. Most clerks just filed them. Margaret read them. And the more she read, the more something bothered her. The data didn't behave randomly. It spoke quietly, consistently, like a voice hidden behind the noise. She began charting every failed launch she could find, using her own notebook when the official forms ran out. Torpedo number 4,219 premature detonation. Number 4,432 contact hit, no explosion. Number 4,721 depth error, ran 11 feet low. After 3 months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Failures clustered in warm water latitudes and high-speed impacts. The deeper the ocean and the faster the target, the higher the chance of malfunction. The math was merciless. At first, she thought she had made an error. She recalculated each variable by hand, checking against test records from as far back as 1938. But every correction reinforced the same conclusion: the Mark 14's control system was lying to itself. Its pressure sensors, calibrated in cold Atlantic water, misread the true depth in the warmer Pacific by a margin large enough to turn a lethal weapon into a dud. She tried to explain it to her supervisor, a polite but weary engineer named Franklin Hall. "Sir, if my calculations are right, the depth control spring is compressing too far under warm conditions. The torpedo believes it's shallower than it really is." Hall smiled tightly and patted her shoulder. "Miss Hutchinson, that's interesting, but it's a mechanical issue, not your concern." That was the end of the conversation, but not the end of her curiosity. At night, when the rest of the department went home, she stayed. The security guard on the night shift got used to seeing the light under her door long after midnight. On her desk sat a small brass model of the torpedo's control section, salvaged from a training display. She'd run her fingers along the tiny pistons and valves, tracing the path of pressure through its tubes. The entire system depended on a few thin membranes that flexed in response to seawater. If those membranes were too sensitive, every degree of temperature shift could throw off the depth by meters. She plotted her findings on the blackboard, connecting field failures to environmental data, barometric pressure, and ocean salinity. By 2 a.m., the chalkboard looked like a storm-lined circle's equations intertwining, like the torpedo's own internal wiring. And there, in the middle of the chaos, one number stared back: 11. The torpedo was running 11 feet deeper than intended. She froze. It matched the same figure Admiral Lockwood's submariners had reported in the field. They had guessed. She had proven it. The next morning, she presented her results to Hall again, this time with the evidence. He read through the calculations in silence. "You're saying the weapon is off by 11 feet across all calibration points?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. Every test case confirms it." He exhaled slowly. "That would mean every attack we've made has been under the target." They both knew what that meant. Thousands of tons of steel, hundreds of sailors' lives, all wasted because of a mathematical oversight. Hall promised to forward her analysis to the Bureau. Weeks passed, no reply. When she asked about it, he looked away. "They're not going to reopen production lines in wartime," he said quietly. "They think it's bad aim." So she did what no one else dared. She began recreating the tests herself. Without authorization, Margaret requisitioned a small hydraulic pressure chamber from the artillery division and adapted it for torpedo components. Inside that humming steel cylinder, she could simulate underwater pressure at different depths. She tested valve springs, pressure sensors, and detonator caps. At 100 feet of simulated depth, the readings were perfect. At 300, the sensors lagged. At 400, they failed entirely. The math and the machine finally agreed the torpedo's brain was misreading the ocean. Her breakthrough should have changed everything. Instead, it buried her further in isolation. The official Navy testers refused to acknowledge her findings, claiming she had no combat experience, no authority, no clearance. The Bureau's pride was a fortress, and her equations were battering its walls. But she refused to stop. She wrote a technical memorandum, 40 pages of raw data sketches and calculations, and mailed it directly to the Pacific Fleet headquarters at Pearl Harbor. No stamp of approval, no signature, just her initials, MSH. It would take months for that report to reach the man who could change everything: Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of the submarine force. When it did, he would finally have the proof he needed to confront Washington. For now, Margaret walked home through the dawn light, exhausted but certain. The war might not know her name, but it was already turning on her math. If you believe that sometimes the quietest people make the loudest impact, comment the number 7. And if you think numbers can be as powerful as weapons tap-like, and stay with us for what happened next when the truth finally surfaced. Pearl Harbor, January 1943. The Pacific sun was just breaking over the Ko'olau Mountains as Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood stepped into the testing range at Kaneohe Bay. The smell of salt and fuel mixed in the air. Around him, crews prepared 3 Mark 14 torpedoes for a series of live-fire trials. Lockwood had been at sea long enough to recognize the expression on every man's face. Exhaustion laced with disbelief. They had seen too many duds, too many explosions that never came. On his desk the night before lay a thin brown envelope with no return address. Inside it, a 40-page memorandum written in dense mathematical shorthand. At the top of the first page, in small type letters, it read, "Evaluation of depth keeping and detonation. Inconsistencies, Mark 14. There was no signature, only the initials MSH. Lockwood had spent the night reading it line by line. By the time he reached the final page, he realized what he was holding wasn't a theory, it was proof. The author had reconstructed the torpedo's entire behavior from launch to detonation using only field reports and pressure equations. The conclusion was devastatingly simple. The Mark 14 was running 11 feet deeper than the setting indicated, and the magnetic exploder was misfiring because the Earth's magnetic field in the Pacific was weaker than the calibration value used during development. The deeper water and latitude difference were combining into failure. It wasn't superstition, incompetence, or bad luck. It was physics. Now Lockwood intended to prove it for himself. "Range clear?" he asked. "Clear, sir," came the reply. The first torpedo left the submarine's forward tube with a roar that echoed across the bay. Through binoculars, the observers watched the silver streak of its track slice through the water. The target was an old hulk moored offshore, a derelict freighter stripped to bare steel. The torpedo should have struck midship. Instead, a faint bubble line passed harmlessly underneath. No explosion, just silence. "Depth recorders show 13 feet below target," a technician called out. Lockwood said nothing. He simply nodded and motioned for the second test. The second torpedo struck metal but failed to detonate. Divers later found the weapon embedded in the hull, its detonator cap crushed flat. Exactly as the report had predicted. The impact piston had jammed against its housing, too rigid to trigger the explosive train. For the third shot, Lockwood ordered modifications according to the memorandum's recommendations: disable the magnetic exploder, recalibrate the depth spring upward by 11 feet, and reinforce the firing pin. The submarine fired again. The torpedo hit dead center. The explosion rolled across the bay like thunder. Water erupted 200 feet into the air. When the spray cleared, the hulk was breaking apart, its midsection torn open. Lockwood lowered his binoculars. "Well," he said quietly, "someone back in Dahlgren just won the war for us." The proof was undeniable. Within days, Lockwood ordered fleet-wide modifications. Every submarine commander in the Pacific received a new instruction: disable the magnetic exploder, set depth to run shallow, and adjust contact detonators according to the Dahlgren calculations. The transformation was immediate and brutal. By March 1943, American submarines began reporting hits that matched expectations. One commander radioed new settings perfect. First salvo destroyed 2 freighters. Explosions reliable. In May, USS Wahoo sank 4 Japanese ships in a single patrol. The statistics told the rest of the story. Torpedo hit rates jumped from 18% to over 70%. But the numbers hid the human cost that had preceded them. 2 years of denial, hundreds of failed missions, and thousands of sailors dead because no one had listened to the math sooner. When Lockwood's formal report reached Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance could no longer hide. They responded with a single line that history would never forget: the matter appears now resolved. It was resolved because one woman with no rank, no authority, and no weapon had dared to question the Navy's most sacred assumption. In Dahlgren, Margaret Hutchinson learned of the breakthrough only through rumor. One morning, a courier dropped off a bundle of field reports for statistical review. As she flipped through them, she saw the new phrase stamped across every page: exploder performance satisfactory. For the first time since the war began, her data showed consistency, precision, predictability, the very qualities she had fought for. She didn't smile. She simply placed her pencil down, knowing the war had shifted by 11 feet of water and one equation written in pencil. But for Lockwood, the discovery was more than technical. It was personal. He had watched his men die for 2 years, blamed for failures that weren't theirs. Now he had the evidence and the fury to match it. In a closed-door meeting, he confronted the Bureau's representatives. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have robbed our submariners of 2 years of war. You've sent them out with pop guns and told them they were cannons." There was no answer, only silence. The full impact of the fix rippled outward across the Pacific. With reliable torpedoes, the U.S. submarine fleet unleashed devastation on Japanese shipping lines. Convoys that had once sailed untouched now vanished overnight. Fuel shortages crippled the Imperial Navy. Entire island garrisons starved, cut off from supplies. By the end of 1943, American submarines had sunk more than 1,000 enemy vessels, a feat made possible, not by a new weapon, but by the correction of one hidden flaw. Yet Margaret's name appeared nowhere in the official documentation. The Dahlgren Memorandum was filed under anonymous technical contributor. When Lockwood later tried to locate its author, he discovered she had been reassigned to an accounting department in Washington. Her work had saved thousands of lives, but in wartime bureaucracy, it was just another set of figures on a page. He wrote her a letter anyway. "Your calculations proved decisive," he began. "They gave us back our confidence, and perhaps more than that, our conscience." It was a letter she would keep for the rest of her life. The war in the Pacific would rage on for another 2 years, but the balance had already shifted. Every torpedo that struck true, every enemy ship that vanished beneath the waves carried within it the echo of her equation, a quiet triumph over arrogance and error. And in that triumph lay one of the most extraordinary truths of the war: that sometimes the greatest victories aren't forged in steel or fire, but written in graphite and patience. If you believe that even the smallest correction can change the outcome of a war, comment the number 7 below. And if you think courage sometimes wears glasses instead of medals, hit the like button and stay for the next part, when truth collides with command and the Navy is forced to face what it tried hardest to deny. Washington, D.C., April 1943. The mahogany-paneled conference room at the Bureau of Ordnance was silent except for the hum of a ceiling fan. Stacks of technical reports lay open on the long table, evidence that no one wanted to read. Admiral Charles Lockwood stood at one end, his face set like stone. Across from him sat the men whose signatures had defended the Mark 14 torpedo through 2 years of disaster. They wore the kind of confidence that came from bureaucracy, not battle. Lockwood placed a file in the center of the table. "Gentlemen," he began, "these are the results of our live tests in Hawaii. 3 torpedoes, 3 shots. The first ran deep, the second hit and failed to detonate. The third, adjusted by 11 feet and modified per recommendations, exploded perfectly." Admiral Ralph Christie shifted in his chair, his tone sharp. "Rear Admiral, with respect, You had no authority to alter Bureau specifications. I had authority. Lockwood replied to stop burying men for your mistakes. No one spoke. Behind the anger in his voice was exhaustion, the fatigue of hundreds of funerals written in coded telegrams. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew the 40-page memorandum marked MSH. The analysis came from one of your own, he said. Someone who understands the physics better than anyone in this building. She solved in weeks what your engineers refused to test in years. A murmur rippled across the table. You're suggesting a civilian mathematician corrected our ordnance, one officer asked. Lockwood didn't blink. I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it. Christie's expression hardened. The Mark 14 passed all Bureau trials. Lockwood leaned forward. Those trials were in shallow water with dummy warheads. You never tested them at combat depth or temperature. You never fired them under real conditions. You built your confidence in a tank, and men died because of it. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Lockwood opened a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed the wreckage of the freighter used in the Hawaiian tests. Its hull split open by a single torpedo impact. That's what happens when you stop denying mathematics, he said quietly. You get results. It should have been a moment of vindication. Instead, it was a moment of defiance. The Bureau refused to issue a public admission of error. To preserve institutional pride, they classified the entire episode as field calibration variance. In official records, no one had been wrong. But outside the walls of Washington, reality was rewriting itself. In the Pacific, submarine commanders were finally reporting success rates that matched their training. Ships that had escaped for months were going down in flames. Convoys broke apart under relentless attack. And for every confirmed kill, Lockwood felt the weight of both triumph and rage. He returned to Pearl Harbor and gathered his officers in the operations room. The map of the Pacific stretched across the wall marked with hundreds of colored pins, each one a ship lost or sunk. Gentlemen, he said, we are now fighting with real weapons. From this point forward, no excuses. Commander Dudley Morton of the USS Wahoo stood and saluted. About time, sir. The tests that followed became legend. In one patrol, Wahoo fired 6 torpedoes using the new settings. All 6 detonated. 6 ships vanished beneath the waves. The success was so shocking that other commanders suspected fabrication until their own results proved identical. The torpedo that had been cursed now became the deadliest weapon in the ocean. Lockwood wrote in his diary that month, "One change, one equation, one unknown woman, and the sea itself turned in our favor." But even as the tide shifted, a quiet war continued behind the scenes. The Bureau of Ordnance launched an internal review not to celebrate the fix, but to protect its reputation. Letters circulated, suggesting that field variability had been the main issue, not a design flaw. Engineers who had raised early concerns were reprimanded for bypassing the chain of command. The official story became sanitized progress through collaboration, success through teamwork. No mention of the years of denial. Lockwood refused to play along. In his next correspondence to the Chief of Naval Operations, he wrote bluntly, "Our submarines have achieved in 3 months what they could not in 2 years. If truth had outweighed politics earlier, we might have saved thousands." It was a dangerous statement in wartime Washington. Critics accused him of insubordination. But the truth had already escaped the walls of secrecy. Among submarine crews across the Pacific, word spread of the woman from Dahlgren, the calculator who had fixed the Navy's deadliest mistake. They didn't know her name, only that someone back east had given them a fighting chance. For Margaret Hutchinson, the recognition meant nothing. She was still in her small office reviewing data, unaware of the storm her calculations had caused. She received a letter through internal mail, "Your contribution acknowledged." Further correspondence unnecessary. It was bureaucratic dismissal disguised as gratitude. She smiled faintly, folded the letter, and slipped it between the pages of her notebook. While Washington protected its pride, the Pacific burned with new precision. In the following 6 months, American submarines sank more than 500,000 tons of Japanese shipping oil tankers, transports, destroyers. The enemy began calling them the invisible wolves. What they didn't know was that those wolves had only learned to hunt because one mathematician had taught their fangs how to bite. If you believe that truth can be silenced but never erased, comment the number 7 below. And if you think pride is the slowest weapon ever to fail hit, and stay with us, because in the next part, you'll see how her discovery turned the tide of an entire ocean. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific Ocean no longer belonged to Japan. It belonged to silence. The silence that came after a detonation, the hollow quiet that followed when a convoy disappeared beneath the waves. What had once been a vast empire connected by sea routes was now a graveyard of ships. From the decks of submarines scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, American commanders radioed back a single phrase that headquarters had not heard in years: targets destroyed. Every success was a vindication, every explosion a testament to a correction born not of steel, but of mathematics. Admiral Lockwood stood on the pier at Pearl Harbor one July morning as the USS Wahoo returned from the patrol. The crew was gaunt and exhausted, but their smiles were unmistakable. They had sunk 6 ships in 14 days. Their torpedoes, the same cursed weapons that had once failed them, now worked flawlessly. Lockwood watched the crew disembark, the men saluting, cheering, some laughing for the first time in months. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Between late 1943 and the end of 1944, U.S. submarines destroyed more than 1,300 Japanese vessels, tankers, cargo ships, destroyers, and troop transports. The total tonnage exceeded 5 million tons, more than all previous years of the war combined. Intelligence reports from Tokyo showed panic spreading through the Imperial Navy. Entire island garrisons were starving, cut off from food and ammunition. Factories in Japan stood idle for lack of raw materials. The ocean that had once sustained the empire was now strangling it. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America's submariners were no longer fighting with luck or desperation. They were fighting with precision. The corrected Mark 14 torpedoes turned at every patrol into a science depth set to 21 feet. Impact angle 45 degrees, detonation delay calibrated to milliseconds. Each launch was a small act of redemption, an invisible apology to the sailors who had died believing their weapons were broken. Yet even as the victories mounted, few knew how they had been made possible. Inside a cramped apartment in Arlington, Virginia, Margaret Hutchinson read the daily casualty bulletins and shipping reports. Like others, read weather forecasts. When she saw the pattern, fewer losses, higher success rates, she knew what it meant. Her equations had left the page and gone to war. Sometimes she would stop by the memorial board at the Dahlgren facility, a wall covered with the names of fallen naval officers. She would stand there in silence, tracing her eyes across the list. In a way, she thought this was her battlefield. Not the roaring seas of the Pacific, but a room filled with graphs, numbers, and calculations that now carried the weight of human lives. The results were staggering. Fleet records later confirmed that at least 12,000 American sailors who would have been lost in failed attacks survived because their torpedoes now detonated as intended. 12,000 men who came home, 12,000 families who did not receive the telegram that began with, "We regret to inform you." In the letters those men sent home, you could read the change in tone. One commander wrote to his wife, "For the first time, our torpedoes worked exactly as they should. You could feel the explosion through the hull. We don't fire and pray anymore. We fire and believe." Another sailor wrote simply, "It feels like the ocean finally fights for us." Back in Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance still refused to acknowledge a mistake. Official reports credited field improvements and updated testing procedures. Margaret's memorandum remained buried in the archives, unclassified only decades later. But among submariners, a legend grew about a woman at a desk in Virginia who had done what no admiral could. They called her the ghost mathematician. In December 1944, as Japan's merchant fleet collapsed under the pressure, Admiral Lockwood visited Dahlgren in person. He wanted to see the facility that had produced the anonymous calculations. The visit was quiet, almost informal. He shook hands with engineers, reviewed equipment, and finally asked who was responsible for the depth correction analysis. No one spoke for a moment. Then Franklin Hall, Margaret's old supervisor, nodded toward a desk near the window. "She was," he said simply. Lockwood walked over. Margaret stood startled. He was taller than she expected, the kind of man who carried both authority and fatigue. He extended his hand. "Miss Hutchinson, you probably don't know it, but you've saved more of my men than I ever could." She hesitated, then shook his hand. "I just wrote down what the numbers said, sir." Lockwood smiled. And the numbers were right. They spoke for less than 10 minutes. No photographers, no ceremony, just quiet acknowledgement between two people who had fought the same enemy in different ways, one with equations, one with command orders. Before leaving, Lockwood handed her a small brass nameplate taken from a torpedo he'd inspected in Pearl Harbor. On the back, he'd engraved a single sentence. 11 feet made all the difference. That night, Margaret placed the plate on her desk beside her slide rule. Outside, snow began to fall over Virginia, soft and unhurried. She looked at the lights of the proving ground reflecting on the river and wondered how many lives were still out there because she had refused to stop calculating. War had made her invisible, but victory had made her immortal. If you believe that real heroes don't need medals to be remembered, comment the number 7 below. And if you think precision can save more lives than power tap-like, and stay with us for the final part, the legacy of the woman who proved that numbers could win a war. The war ended with a sound that Margaret Hutchinson would never hear, the echo of peace rolling across the Pacific in August 1945. Cities that had burned now lay silent. Fleets that once ruled the sea rested on the ocean floor, and somewhere between those wrecks and the calm waters above them were the invisible traces of equations that had changed everything. When the Navy's official reports on ordnance performance were published that autumn, the Mark 14 torpedo appeared near the top of the list. Reliable and effective, the summary read. There was no mention of the failures that had come before, no acknowledgement of the corrections that had made it so. The Bureau of Ordnance congratulated itself on continuous improvement under wartime pressure. The name MS Hutchinson appeared only once, buried in an appendix labeled Statistical Review, Civilian Technical Staff. It might as well have been a footnote in a storm. Margaret never sought recognition. She returned to teaching mathematics at a small college in Maryland, trading equations of war for the geometry of peace. Her students knew her as quiet, exacting, endlessly patient. Few ever guessed that the woman explaining parabolas and pressure curves had once rewritten the science of naval warfare. When asked about the war, she would only smile faintly and say, "Numbers behave the same no matter the century." But those who knew the truth, the submariners who had lived because of her calculations, never forgot. In 1951, a group of veterans from the Pacific Fleet sent her a plaque engraved with the words, to the unknown mathematician who gave our weapons back their courage. She kept it on her office wall until the day she retired. Years later, as wartime archives were declassified, historians began piecing together the story that the Navy had tried to bury. They found the memorandum, the equations, the corrections, and the initials typed at the top. The revelation spread quietly through the community of naval engineers. The ghost mathematician finally had a name. Captain John Alden, a submarine historian, wrote, "Her analysis was not simply technical, it was moral. She forced a great machine, both mechanical and bureaucratic, to admit it was wrong. That courage saved more sailors than any admiral's strategy." By then, Margaret was long retired, living in a modest house overlooking the river at Dahlgren. Visitors would sometimes come asking for interviews. She declined most of them, preferring silence to ceremony. When one young engineer asked how it felt to have changed the course of the war, she simply replied, "I didn't change it. The truth did." In 1972, the Navy officially acknowledged the design flaws in the Mark 14 and commended the civilian analysis team, whose work corrected the depth control mechanism. Her name was read aloud in a single sentence at a closed ceremony. No photographs, no headlines. But for those who understood what it meant, that single acknowledgement was more powerful than any medal. She died in 1983 at the age of 70, leaving behind a box of notebooks filled with calculations, all written in pencil. In the margins of one, she had written a line that seemed to summarize her entire life. Precision is another word for respect. Today, when naval officers study the history of undersea warfare, her equations are part of the curriculum, not as myth, but as method. Every torpedo fired since carries within its circuitry the legacy of her correction, the understanding that even perfection must be tested, and that truth is not a threat, but a tool. In the end, Margaret Hutchinson didn't win medals, promotions, or parades. She won something rarer, the quiet immortality of being right when it mattered most. If you believe that history is written not only by generals, but by those who dare to correct them, comment the number 7 below. And if you think truth needs no rank to prevail, hit like and subscribe, because more stories like this are waiting to surface from the forgotten corners of World War II.